Scientists from around the country have staged rallies to protest federal government cuts to scientific programs and the so-called muzzling of government scientists. Even the New York Times chimed in with an editorial last month. Is science being silenced in Canada? Joining us now to discuss that, in our nation's capital, Jonathan Kay. He's Comment Page's editor with the National Post. And with us here in studio, Mehrdad Hariri, CEO and co-founder of the Canadian Science Policy Conference, Adam Brown, assistant professor of biology at the University of Ottawa, and Chris Turner, author of The War on Science, Muzzled Scientists and Willful Blindness in Stephen Harper's Canada. Welcome, everybody, and Chris, get off the fence. Tell us what you really think.
Happy to.
John, good to see you in Ottawa again, and guys, thank you for being here around the table. Chris, I do want to start with you, just because the book is very much the foundation for our discussion today. The book opens with a protest by lab-coated scientists on Parliament Hill, summer 2012. That's a pretty rare occurrence any day of the week. What were they protesting specifically?
Well, the I think the initial motivation, or the most recent motivation for it, was the many cuts that were in the omnibus budget bill in the spring of 2012. That Bill C-38, which rewrote the Fisheries Act, rewrote the Navigable Waters Act, changed all kinds of things to environmental protection and monitoring, defunded a couple of very critical research labs. That really, I think, was the the sort of last straw for a lot of scientists. Scientists, by their nature, not the sort of people who generally get together and chant in the street, but really, I think that moment, that sense that there was just this relentless attack coming at them from a federal government that no longer seemed to want or value their work, really pushed them all out into the street.
It's that notion of how unusual this was that I want to follow up on, because people of a certain age will remember in Ontario in 1985, there were doctors who opposed a ban on extra billing. They went to Queen's Park in their medical coats, and people were astonished. They could not believe their GPs were out there protesting like everybody else at Queen's Park. What was the reaction when scientists did this on Parliament Hill?
Well, I think it had a similar reaction. I mean, it really did get a lot of attention. It got not just in Canada, but international media attention. And I think because we do think of scientists really as, in a sense, this sort of cloistered society that deals in hard fact, data, peer review. They mostly talk amongst themselves and every now and then present their findings to the public, and that they would suddenly leave the lab and very visibly say, we are out here not as a partisan political force. We are out here as scientists saying, the bedrock of what we do as scientists is under attack. Got a lot of attention. I think it startled a lot of people, and I think it was sort of a wake-up call for a lot of Canadians that there was something extraordinary going on with our science.
It's one thing to say, we scientists disagree with conservative government policy on X, Y, and Z. It is another thing to say, this government is muzzling us. This government is prohibiting us from speaking. So let's get some examples here. Give me the most egregious example that you would point to of, in your view, this government muzzling scientists.
Right. Well, I think the International Polar Year Conference, which was also in 2012 and was hosted in Montreal, was probably for a lot of scientists was a pretty shocking example of this muzzling. What happened was the Environment Canada scientists who were there presenting their papers, talking to their peers in what is very much thought of as a place that where the open dialogue that's essential to science can be carried out. These Environment Canada scientists were accompanied by Environment Canada media handlers, communications people, and basically, if you had a question on one of the panels for one of Environment Canada's scientists, it had to be directed to this media handler. And you're there with the peers in your science community from around the world. You're the host country, and you have this sort of media minder who is interfering with the free and open flow of communication in that kind of a forum. I think that was along with some of the other more smaller individual cases, that was certainly a pretty startling example of how hard this government was pushing message control.
But let me follow up. Are you saying that scientists were directly told you are forbidden from speaking upon threat of what? Losing your job? What?
Yeah, there's a threat there without I don't know if it was ever made perfectly clear. What was made perfectly clear was you may speak, present your paper, but if there is any follow-up question, if anything from the audience asks you, what are the implications of that? What might it mean, to society in general, to public policy, that sort of thing? You are not to answer those questions. You are to redirect them to us. I think the implied threat is this will be very, very bad for your career if you step out of line, without, I think, it ever being stated quite that boldly.
Why do you think this is the government's position?
Well, I think more than anything else, they are very much interested in pursuing a policy regardless of the evidence for or against it. And they would rather not have mixed messages in the public eye. They really, really value central command and control. They, the Prime Minister's office especially is probably the most obsessed with message discipline of any that we've ever seen in Canada. And so to their mind, if it's our government, we don't want anyone putting out any messages under our banner that don't stay consistent with what we have said is the policy direction. And we are, then they know this, pursuing some policy directions that are quite controversial, that do have enormous potential impacts on the natural environment, for example. And we know there's going to be blowback if we don't control those messages.
Okay, that's Chris Turner. The War on Science is his book. Let's get some feedback now from around the table and in Ottawa, where I want to go first. Jonathan Kay, you've heard what he's had to say. What's your view?
Well, it's a very interesting book. I actually had the opportunity to read the book on the trip here. However, I think there's a big picture which this has to be contextualized in, which is why is the Harper government so concerned with messaging on science? And I think that goes to a few larger phenomena that are interesting to explore. The Harper government is basically the first Canadian government to exist in the age of Twitter. And it's the first government, you could say, well, it's the most controlling of information of any government Canada has ever had, but because of the technology that has emerged in the last decade or so, it's also the first government that has really had to contend with social media and the fact that if a scientist or anybody else says something that's off message at any podium in the country, anywhere, 5 seconds later that's on social media. So to a certain extent, the Conservative government is simply reacting to the new communications technology. The other thing is, I think it's very interesting how much the issue of global warming has radicalized conservatives and their attitudes towards science. Certainly in my journalistic lifetime, it's the only issue that really has created a situation where you have a lot of conservatives who are simply at war with reality, where there's a mainstream consensus on global warming, a lot of conservatives simply reject it for ideological reasons, and as a result, the whole issue of science and scientists has come into sort of a suspect odor for many conservatives. And a lot of the policies that are described in the book, I think, emerge indirectly from that general suspicion that science and scientists are somehow collaborating against conservative policies.
Adam Brown, what's your view on the premise of the book?
Well, I think that it's important to recognize that all governments are entitled to put out messaging, and that's what they do, of course. However, in a democracy, the messaging is supposed to be able to be accountable on some level, and that the public are supposed to be able to assess the integrity of those messages. So I think it's clear that there is messaging going on here with respect to what the Harper government is saying about science or not about science. But let's be clear here, science is not some entity that exists out there between the molecules of nature. It's not some special interest group. It's a process of elucidating facts about the natural world. It's a process of inquiry that tells us about the Earth, its ecosystems, ourselves, our health, the universe. And so really it's a process by which we get our facts. And so when we talk about messaging from the government, it's very important to recognize that messaging is supposed to be based on evidence, and that the public is supposed to have access to that evidence in order to assess the facts for themselves and to see whether or not the government is accurately representing them. Now, science itself doesn't propose any policies, it doesn't have any opinions, it's just, it is this way. Now, what you do with that information is the next step. If the government chooses not to pay attention to information that is important to Canadians, then they are entitled to do so. But it is it's important that Canadians know that they have made a decision to ignore certain pieces of information. So science is not a picking and choosing of facts that appeal to you. It is an overall assessment of all of the information that we have at hand.
And your suggestion is the politics is not?
And of course politics is not. Of course there's going to be some streamlining of messaging in order to get a certain idea across. But of course it's important in a democracy that we're able to assess where they get their information from and how accurate it is.
Sure. Mirdad, your view on the premise of the book?
Well, I haven't read the book, but I want to touch on the other element of your question, and that is a rare event of scientists protesting in the Parliament Hill. And I would like to say that we have to get to use to the presence of scientists as a community, as an interest group in various aspects of civic life. And that's, I think, scientific community should get their act together to have a very strong science advocacy groups. They have the rights to protest, obviously. I may not agree and on the same page as that. But
did you disagree with the protest they held on Parliament Hill?
I don't think that's, no, I did not disagree, but I didn't agree to that this is the solution to our problem. I am more in line with the more conversation, communication, getting the message out, let the public engage in this process, and make sure that we have considered all the elements of the equation. I am more for communication and bringing various stakeholders on the table to discuss the issue.
Okay, John, let me follow up with something you said. We know that, at least I think we know, that the Conservative Party, out of all the political parties in Canada, relies more than any of the others on a base of people who believe in God, who are religious. And is part of this, if we're to accept the premise of the book, war on science or war on evidence, is part of it that the Conservative government needs to protect that base, or needs to look like it's protecting that base, and thus the discomfort with science? What do you think?
I would say that that's not as much a factor in Canada as in the United States. I think in the United States, something like 30% of the population self-identifies evangelicals. In Canada, something closer to 10%, I think. I think that was overstated in the last decade by Paul Martin and the people around him, because they wanted to scare Canadians into thinking that Harper and the people around him were just a bunch of Bible thumpers who were going to eliminate women's right to choose. I don't see that as a huge influence in Harper's government, especially since Harper himself seems to have kept his distance away from the sort of people who reject evolutionary science and that kind of thing. However, I do think that the rejection of global warming science and mainstream climate science remains a powerful influence within conservative Canadian circles. And that, in a way, has just as much bearing on policy, especially in an energy superpower like Canada. Because if you reject the theory of anthropogenic climate change, then it's going to completely skew your attitude toward the exploitation of our natural resources. So I think maybe there's a little bit too much focus on sort of old school theological hang-ups about evolution and that kind of thing. The more modern battle in regards to science is about global warming science and the reality of climate change. And that battle, ideologically, is still very much alive in the United States and in Canada, and it's taken as a point of faith among many small c conservatives that global warming is just something that Al Gore made up. And if you're proceeding on that assumption, then of course, logically, it makes a lot of sense to muzzle a Canadian scientist who's going out and talking to the media about an issue that may suggest that we need to do more about rising carbon levels in the atmosphere.
Okay, let me follow up on this issue of muzzling. And Chris, I want you to respond first to something that was in Bloomberg News. This is about a year ago, but it still holds up. Here we go. Our response to media inquiries is exemplary, said Mark Johnson, a spokesperson for Environment Canada. In 2011, Environment Canada received more than 3,100 media calls, he said, citing internal records. Johnson said agency officials, including scientists, completed more than 1,200 media interviews plus hundreds of email responses. Johnson did acknowledge that Environment Canada scientists face restrictions on what they can talk about, but he said the same rules apply to all public servants. Quote, in Canada's democratic system of government, commenting on government policy is reserved for ministers and their designated spokespeople, he said. This is a fundamental tenet of our public service values. Has he got a point?
Well, credit where it's due, that is excellent obfuscation. He has skated right past the actual problem and drawn out a barrage of statistics to back himself up. This war on science is not about silencing all scientists. It's understood that the civil service includes, a certain loyalty to the government of the day. Civil servants aren't free to necessarily speak in public about public policy. It's part of their job. But the truth is that for many generations, journalists, the general public, had fairly ready access to scientists. In fact, in a lot of departments, scientists were encouraged to get out there and talk up their work, to demonstrate, hey, look at these great things that we're doing with all that money you gave us, and we're really proud of the work we're doing. What we see now is if you do certain kinds of science, stuff that's pro-industry, things that are in sort of R&D and technological innovation, absolutely, you will be out there, you will be talking, you will get the full support of government to do that. But as Jonathan says, if your science involves climate change, major environmental disruption caused by industry, that sort of thing, suddenly it gets a lot more difficult for you to speak. And even if you do, and this has happened, for example, with a scientist by the name of David Tarasik, who was discovered a hole in the ozone layer over the Arctic, when he finally did get to speak to a journalist at Post Media News, the journalist discovered basically halfway through the conversation that there was an Environment Canada media minder sitting in on the call.
Which he didn't know at the beginning of it.
He was unaware of when he went into it.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's creepy.
That's creepy, says John Kay.
It's very creepy. Yeah.
Adam, let me get you to comment first on this next thing that I'm going to read out here, because I think this is a colleague of yours, Rhys Casson, University of Ottawa professor in the Faculty of Science and Department of Biology, who said the following: researchers must recognize that poor scientific decisions in politics do not necessarily result from a lack of understanding. They are rather a failure of scientists to communicate their message effectively in what is ultimately a political, not a scientific arena. A former top bureaucrat in the Canadian Civil Service once gave me the political perspective on this divide. Scientists, he said, think too highly of their own view of the world and fail to appreciate the complex, multifarious nature of decision-making. Our mistake, meaning scientists' mistake, is to think that science will be given a privileged voice on an issue. This is almost always wrong. From a politician's point of view, science is an interest group like any other. Your take on that?
Yeah, well, I would agree with what Rhys said, because he does deal with a lot of discussions with policymakers on the issue of science. But the idea here is that science it informs the discussion. It doesn't decide the discussion. So to say that science is some special interest group is a misunderstanding of what science is.
But that's what politicians think.
Of course, right, and it is a misunderstanding of what science is. So perhaps we have some work to do in order to correct that. And the second point being that it's related to communication, of course.
Are you lousy communicators? I mean, you don't seem to be here. You seem to be perfectly fine. But
well, thank you. But there is a reason why one of the most common stereotypes of scientists is that they are these sort of bumbling, sort of introverted, nerdy that can't communicate, speaking in technical jargon at 100 feet over everybody's head.
It's a stereotype because
it exists.
Because it's true.
Yeah, and it is true because that's the way we train scientists at universities to speak about science. Traditionally, the university curriculum to train communication components in science have dealt with scientists communicating to other scientists, such as lab reports, such as talks at scientific conferences, such as articles being published in peer-reviewed journals. And this involves a very highly specialized and highly technical form of communication. This works very well in the scientific discourse among scientists. It's highly efficient. It manages to pass a lot of highly specialized and technical information in a very small, compact space, and it decreases ambiguity. However, when you talk that way to members of the general public, it goes right over their head because they are not trained as scientists to be able to acknowledge all of these various specialized forms of communication.
Let me get Mehrdad on that. I mean, you hang out with scientists all the time. That's your thing.
That's right.
Are they bad communicators?
It's not a problem of having or being a bad communicator or good communicator. The issue is, and what my good friend Rhys refers to, is the fact that science enterprise should understand that they need to have a strategy as an entity among other entities in the society to communicate their message and to have a communication strategy with public at large, to get public on their side, and that's a specialty by itself. It's not on the base of the good communication on behalf of one or two individual scientists, rather a machinery, a communication machinery, so that get publics mobilized to their support. That's number one. And how to communicate with politicians and policymakers and governments, that's the other way, that's the other angle. And the third angle is how to get media actually involved in the whole process where these interest of science community is a matter of discussion. In other words, I would say that, in fact, scientists should have receptors in Parliament Hill and political body in order to get their message.
What, sorry?
Receptors.
Receptors, okay.
Yes, and in fact, so that comes with having more scientists, and in fact, some scientists to run for public offices and become MPs and MPPs and in different levels of the government.
But they hate politics. Why would they run for it?
Not necessarily.
They hate partisan politics. Of course, they deal with politics in their university lives, but partisan politics they don't like.
It's different from bringing politics into science but asking individual scientists, 0.1% of those, to run for public offices, those who have the right qualifications, those who are interested in running for public offices and are the right people to represent the scientific community across political parties, in fact, and that's very important. And that has two, I guess, consequences. Number one is that then there are receptors in Parliament Hill for science enterprise. Number two is, in fact, I would say the culture of Parliament Hill will be completely different if 10% of MPs are from science and scientific community. And I think you would agree with me.
I'm sure that's probably very true, yes. John, let me get you to follow up with this. We're in an age now in politics in the country where everything is, not everything, a lot of things are very ideological. Scientists are not ideological. Does that put them offside from so much of the political process in the country today?
Well, I think to a certain extent it marginalizes them. And I think, you know, the best part of the book is these vignettes of scientists trying to communicate with reporters and having some creepy Soviet-style minder, either electronically or actually in person, lurking over their shoulder in case they say a syllable that's off message with the government's agenda. There's a great example in the book, for instance, of an Ottawa Citizen reporter who's trying to do a story on this innocuous scientific study of snow, you know, the most Canadian subject imaginable. And in order to get permission to talk to this Ottawa Citizen reporter, the scientist in question, I think, had to talk to 18 different bureaucrats, and the thing was escalated to the PMO media office at one point, I think. I mean, it's absolutely appalling. And very few scientists are going to want to work under those conditions. You know, I have a background in science myself. I used to be did graduate studies in engineering. I spent a lot of time doing funding requests and trying to get money from the government to support my research. And a lot of the people I work with did the same thing. And when people couldn't get funding or they didn't feel there was support for that area of research in government, often those people would go to the United States. So the ultimate upshot of this is that people who are employable in the United States, people who are good scientists, people who want to do good unfettered research, they're probably going to end up in other countries. And our own country's commitment to support of science, technology, engineering, and math is going to be affected by an ideological mission to make science compliant with the government's agenda.
John, follow up with this, though. I've, for decades, been hearing people say politics would be so different if we could have more scientists, more engineers as elected members. It would change. And Mehrdad has said it again on the program today. Given your background and given the interactions you have in politics and with politicians, is that just spitting in the wind? It just seems that these people are too smart to want to go into politics because they know what that means for their lives.
Well, we had an accomplished scientist who ran for a major party. His name was Marc Garneau. Folks decided he was too wonky and too boring, and he was passed over. And I think there's probably a lot of technically minded folks who fall into that category. That they're extremely accomplished in technical fields, they know a lot about important scientific areas, but if they don't have the skills necessary for retail politics, which have very little to do with science and technology, they probably are not going to make it as influential politicians. They might become backbenchers, but I think this book that we're talking about, there are several vignettes that show the fate of backbenchers who want to stand up for good science. They end up humiliating themselves in question period, reading out statements written for them by the Prime Minister's office, which often are at variance with the scientific principles that they believe in their heart.
Chris, you want to give an example of that?
Well, the one example that stands out the most is an MP from interior British Columbia. I'm trying to remember, I think it's David Wilkes, I believe is his name. You know, junior backbench MP. During the Bill C-38 run-up, he was, taped or videoed by a constituent. He was at a constituent meeting in the interior British Columbia and said, you know, I'm hearing your concerns. I have concerns myself. We definitely need these things to be addressed before this bill gets passed. And you know, if I believe he says, you know, if these if these things aren't addressed, I would consider voting against it. And that happened. You know, that video went viral online.
He publicly acknowledged doubt about his government's position.
He did, and he was speaking in sort of off the cuff with just a handful of constituents. Maybe didn't even know he was being recorded.
In a quasi-private setting, if you like.
Yeah, but then that went public, and before the day was out, there was a clearly scripted statement on his MP website saying, I fully endorse Bill C-38 and all the wonder and beauty that it is going to bring the great Canadian people. And that was the last we ever heard from that backbencher. And that is the kind of message discipline and message control and you know, clearly setting an example. If you step out of line, there is going to be serious trouble.
See, Mayor Dad, now you want more scientists and engineers in public life, and yet this is what they'll have to deal with, which is insane if they do that. So why does a sensible person want to go into this line of work?
Yeah, but that happens to all the politicians from all disciplines. I mean, that has nothing to do with being from science background or engineering background.
But it's particularly egregious, I'm suggesting, for a scientist, unlike a lawyer or a teacher or somebody else, to have to say something that they just patently know is not true. Fair?
That's part of the game in politics when you enter into that, but you have a bigger mission to accomplish. And that's what your purpose and goal into entering the politics. However, I must say one thing in terms of the individual scientists. They are not just backbencher. Kelly Leach from Conservative just got a junior ministry role. Mark Yagno himself is a very influential person in the Liberal Party. Kennedy Stewart, PhD in public policy, he's also a very influential person in the NDP caucus. So we see very successful models, and I'm sure we can replicate those.
Okay, I have to at this point just thank Jonathan Kay for appearing on the program today. Apparently Jonathan has a real job that he has to go do now. So John, we thank you for your participation and look forward to having you on again. Thanks for being there for us from Ottawa tonight.
Thank you.
Okay, let's continue here, and I want to now go to, Chris, in your book, The War on Science, you point out that there have been what you call targeted cuts directed at environmental science in particular, especially within that budget bill that you just referenced a second ago. Do you want to give us a specific, here's an example of how they're targeting science?
Right. So I think one of the most egregious examples, certainly one that I think a lot of scientists in Canada and beyond were most alarmed by, was the defunding of the Experimental Lakes area in Northern Ontario.
What was that?
So the Experimental Lakes area was basically a living laboratory. It's 58 lakes up north of Kenora that have been set aside since 1968 as a living lab. And David Schindler, one of the world's foremost freshwater biologists, set up the lab, made groundbreaking studies. The ELA was the place where we discovered that phosphates were doing damage to our freshwater ecosystems. It's where we discovered the mechanisms that were causing acid rain. Both cases directly led to not just Canadian but international policy changing in terms of the regulation of certain kinds of pollutants. So the ELA is one scientist described it as, it's our Large Hadron Collider. It's a world-class facility, one of a kind, nothing else like it.
How did it get cut?
And it was a line item that was eliminated in that omnibus budget.
The whole thing?
Yes. The funding was completely eliminated. It sort of, flapped in the breeze for a while, and then the Ontario government and an NGO based in Winnipeg stepped in to take over.
And they saved it.
Well, it carries on, yes. But it got to the point where the DFO was going in, Department of Fisheries officials were going in and removing doors and dismantling labs before we got to that point.
Adam, let me play devil's advocate here. Okay. This may not be an example of the federal government's war on science. This may be an example of a federal government believing that this work is more appropriately handled by provincial rather than federal authorities. This federal government may also believe that we're running huge deficits nowadays, and we've got to cut things. And science shouldn't be immune from cuts, as every other department is not immune from cuts. What's wrong with those explanations?
Well, one of the things that's wrong with those explanations is that the aspect of science, apart from the environmental science studies and regulations that have been cut through the various agencies and organizations, the other aspect of science that's been cut is that of basic research, which is basically exploratory research that tells us about the workings of the natural world.
But you're moving off my question. But the question is strictly related to that Experimental Lakes project in Northern Ontario, which the feds got out of, and the Liberal government of Ontario picked up the torch of and has now kept it going. The federal excuse was, this is not our work, this is your work. You want to keep it going, that's great, but we got to start to get our books in line. Maybe that's the explanation as opposed to any war on science. Is that possible?
Well, I'm a biology professor, so I'm not an expert in government economics, but from what I've seen, it doesn't make economic sense to go after such small ticket items in terms of the budgets that are allocated to ELA, something on the order of $2 million a year, if I'm not mistaken, to run that, which gave world-class results and very, very important information with respect to what we understand about how the environment works now. So while I can't give you an answer on what would be the best budgetary decision to make, you can say clearly it doesn't make economic sense in the sense that this is a trade-off, that this is a question of priorities, because there are a lot of other funds in the government that could be coming from other places to cover this.
I'm going to read something Paul Wells did in Maclean's magazine, who wrote the following. Now, here's the thing. When critics attack the Harper government on its approach to science, the government has an easy comeback, which has the distinct advantage of being true. It is spending more on science than any Canadian government ever has. The Conservatives came to office with no strong idea about what to do in the field and eventually decided to hold and slowly increase the overall budgets they inherited from the Liberals. And I think, Control Room, we've got a chart on this which we can bring up. Why don't we just bring this up right now? Because it does show from about a decade ago till present day that the money for science basically went up and up and up and up, peaking in about, where is that, 2010-11, at $11.9 billion. It's tailed off a bit since then, but essentially, certainly the government is spending more on science and technology today than it was when it came into office. So if you look at that kind of a chart, Mehrdad, is it fair to say that there's a Conservative government war on science?
I'm not sure if we can call it war on science, but one principle that has to be adopted by any government, I guess, around the world, and especially in Canada, because we are in competition with other emerging global powerhouse of science and technology, is the sustained and good level of funding for science and technology. In fact, if you look at the other data in terms of the spending on the higher education has decreased since 2009. We were in the 4th place, now we are in 9th. In terms of 4th place among the OECD countries, in terms of the ratio of spending on higher education to GDP.
Okay.
And with respect to spending on science, government science, again in the ratio to GDP, our status reduced and we went down. And in terms of the business spending in research and development, obviously we are very below among the developed nations.
Can you measure success by the amount of money you spend?
I think that that's essential factor for success. It's not the only tools of measuring the success, obviously. There are various, this is a very complex, obviously, equation, and you cannot measure the success only by way of how much money we spend, but certainly that's an essential element, and that has been proven in all the other countries. And in fact, I just want to make another case that the comparison with other countries is very important here, because, for example, you look at the new emerging powerhouse of science and technology, South Korea, Singapore, and Finland, and Sweden, and Israel, and others, and the ratio of spending investment money is huge.
Chris, you saw the chart. They would make the case that we don't have a war on science. We're spending more on science than any government ever has.
Right. Well, I think that chart demonstrates two things. The first is that any argument about austerity being the motivation behind the cuts in the omnibus budget bill and beyond is a false one. Clearly, it's not a question of not having the money, because they are, in fact, and they like to talk about how much money they've spent. The second thing we learned from that is that this is a government that is not, across the board defunding science research. It is defunding certain kinds of research. Anything close to the environment, as Jonathan Kay mentioned earlier, climate change.
So stuff that fights their particular ideological wheelhouse.
Right, and whereas they are very much pro-business, and they want to be seen as a champion of Canadian industry, a champion of Canadian resource extraction and development. So if you are doing applied research, if you are working with business to get a technological innovation to market, that's going to get the money. And so if you talk to scientists, not even just in the government, but even academic scientists who are doing certain kinds of research that isn't necessarily industry focused or have any kind of immediate economic application, they are finding even the federal funding through various academic bodies is decreasing for them and increasingly shifting to this applied research. And it's not that the applied research is a bad thing, it's just that you do need to do both. And there are certain things—
Applied and basic.
Yes, absolutely.
30 seconds to go here. I know your book's about the federal situation with the Harper government, but I note that the Ontario Environmental Commissioner, Gord Miller, said, "Protections for species at risk have been gutted." This is in the province of Ontario, a Liberal government. "When we start to treat nature and species like a bunch of widgets in a factory, we've completely lost sight of what's truly important for our communities and our very identity as Ontarians." Is this happening everywhere, regardless of what party's in power?
Well, I think you do see scientists having maybe difficulty, justifying their funding across the board. I think what's happening at the federal government level is much more severe than anything that's happening at the provincial level, though. There are certain things, that sort of basic data gathering, that establishment of what is true about the world around us. Really, only the federal government does that. It's the reason why our weather reports come from Environment Canada. They have the capacity to do so, and to be defunding that, particularly as we move into a more and more volatile climate situation, is incredibly reckless.
Gotcha. Mehrdad Hariri, the chair of the Canadian Science Policy Conference, we thank you for coming in today and sharing your views. Adam Brown, the Associate Professor of Biology at the University of Ottawa, thank you for being here. And Chris Turner, author of The War on Science, Muzzled Scientists and Willful Blindness in Stephen Harper's Canada. We thank you for coming in tonight as well.
It was a pleasure.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.